Bitcoin has just survived an assassination attempt, and the most surprising thing is that no one even noticed. While everyone was drawing charts trying to understand the reason for the Bitcoin price crash, behind the scenes, the most massive sabotage in recent years took place. This wasn't just a price correction. It was an attempt to quietly destroy the industry. The bad news is that this isn't the end yet. The good news is that the battle isn't over. The final showdown is scheduled for January 15th, 2026. That's the day when the fate of the old and new financial systems will be decided. We'll see either the beginning of a new era or a forced liquidation that will set the markets back years. The old system has just struck not at the cryptocurrency market, but at the foundation of new money. They're trying to knock Microstrategy and even Trump out of the game before it's too late, which means this is a war by the banks not only against Bitcoin, but against your freedom. And their weapon isn't laws, but banking regulations that aren't written about in the news. Unfortunately for them, they've left a lot of traces. I have evidence, timelines, documents, and even names in my hands. I hope nothing happens to me after this video. Well, now I'll show you exactly what happened. And it all started not now, but back on October 10th, 2025. The Bitcoin crash that began on October 10th wasn't a coincidence. It was a coordinated political attack on cryptocurrency, timed literally to the minute. Timestamps prove that numerous institutions, major banks, agencies, and political players synchronously struck at Microstrategy and a bunch of other companies connected to Bitcoin. The target isn't even Bitcoin itself, but Donald Trump and the financial system he's building. But why do they need this? The thing is, Trump isn't just supporting Bitcoin in words. He's tied to it with his own money. He's using it as a battering ram to break through the very old financial system where politicians, bankers, and even the US Fed sit. This is the system that's now turned against him. So on October 10th, we saw the most massive liquidation of crypto traders in history. 1.6 million traders lost absolutely everything. This was the most massive wipeout of leveraged positions we've ever seen. But when exactly did this happen? It happened on Friday evening, when the European market was already closed, the Asian one hadn't opened yet, and the American one was on the verge of closing. This is the moment when there was minimal liquidity on the market, the perfect time for an attack. And right at that same second, on that same day, MSCI, without announcing anything, simply published a proposal that could kick any company holding Bitcoin as a reserve asset out of all global indexes. Look at the publication time. That was the trigger that launched the crash of the cryptocurrency market, altcoins and Bitcoin. But the media doesn't talk much about it. I follow the news, and I didn't see a single word about it on October 10th. Did you? They all stayed silent about it. Meanwhile, traditional finance acted instantly. All this time, we've been guessing what happened on October 10th and why Bitcoin has been experiencing such a powerful dump since then. Why are Microstrategy shares crashing? Now we know. But what is MSCI? They're the ones who compile the shopping list for global capital. Pension funds like BlackRock and Vanguard don't sit and pick each stock manually. They do passive investing based on the list that MSCI compiles. If your asset makes it onto this list, congratulations. Thousands of computer algorithms around the world just got a signal to buy it. If your asset is removed from this list, thousands of algorithms immediately sell that asset. But how much money does MSCI have under management? $18 trillion. You heard that right, trillions of dollars. And on October 10th, right on the day of this massive crypto liquidation, they publish a document with a very important change for us. How to properly treat companies whose business is tied to Bitcoin. MSCI added a new category for assets. Companies with treasuries in digital assets, for example, in Bitcoin, with one condition. If you have more than 50% of assets in cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, you don't have the right to be on the MSCI list. If this rule comes into effect, Microstrategy and other Bitcoin treasury companies will simply fly out of the MSCI lists, which means funds and computer algorithms around the world will automatically sell their shares. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is much deeper. After implementing this rule, these companies could become toxic and unattractive to investors, meaning it will be harder for them to raise money. And if Microstrategy can't raise money, it will stop buying Bitcoin. And if it doesn't buy Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin will stop rising. And if the price stops rising and starts falling, there's a risk that Microstrategy will even start selling its Bitcoins. Microstrategy's CEO says this will happen if the so-called MNAV drops below 1. That's why Microstrategy is already starting to build up a dollar reserve to try to avoid such a scenario. Do you understand the scheme? Bitcoin treasury companies were the main drivers of this cycle, and if MSCI implements this rule, it will literally hit the main brake on the crypto industry. So now we know what triggered the crash on October 10th and the subsequent crisis in the Bitcoin and altcoin markets. But it turns out this was only the second act of the Malazonsky ballet. The first strike was delivered much earlier. Look at this chart. On July 7th, Microstrategy is trading at its historical highs. Everything's fine. And suddenly JP Morgan sends out a strange letter to investors. Suddenly, the bank raised the margin requirements for Microstrategy shares from 50% to 95%. And so you understand, letters like this are usually sent if a company is on the brink of collapse or bankruptcy. But what does this mean in practice? It means investors can no longer use Microstrategy shares as collateral. Anyone who bought these shares on leverage or used them as security for other trades suddenly, in 1 second, no longer met the bank's requirements. And what do they have to do? Well, of course, sell. On July 7th, JP Morgan twisted investors' arms, and after that, the forced liquidation of their positions in Microstrategy shares began. But why do this if the company wasn't on the brink of bankruptcy? Volatility was at its lowest levels. There were no changes in Microstrategy's business model. In other words, JP Morgan simply had no reason for such a radical action. Therefore, the conclusion is simple. This letter to investors had only one goal: to strike at a specific company, Microstrategy. And look at what happened next. On July 7th, Microstrategy shares flew downward. And if they're pressuring Microstrategy itself, the main large buyer of Bitcoin on the market, what happens to Bitcoin itself? That's right, it follows suit. Look at the Bitcoin chart. The peak was on July 7th, and since then, the price has only gone down. Do you think JP Morgan stopped there? Not at all. At the most difficult moment, when the market was already on its back and liquidity was at zero, JP Morgan made a control shot. They released a report in which they wrote, "If the new MSCI rule is adopted and S&P 500 and Nasdaq follow suit, Microstrategy shares worth $9 billion will be forcibly sold." JP Morgan disseminated this warning through Bloomberg, Reuters, CNBC, Wall Street Journal, and so on. But let's be honest. First, the numbers are pulled out of thin air, and second, things like this don't happen by accident. Not with such perfect timing. And it's certainly not by accident that this hit list included not only Microstrategy, but also Donald Trump's Bitcoin company. Remember how, back under Biden, they tried to cut Trump and his media company off from the banking system? JP Morgan didn't just close his accounts, they refused to accept a deposit from Trump Media for $1 billion. Think about it. A bank refused $1 billion. Does that happen often? And what did they do after that? They leaked all the information about this company to the Department of Justice, every transaction, every paper, even those documents that appeared before the company was created. And now appreciate the timing. The accounts were blocked right at the moment when this company was going public. The blow was struck when it was mortally dangerous. Yes, Trump Media still went public under the ticker DJT, but the goal of the attack wasn't to stop the company's launch. The goal was to bleed it dry before the launch, and they succeeded. Look at the chart. And today, the Florida Attorney General says it straight. JP Morgan coordinated its actions with Biden's people. The bank leaked information so the feds could cook up a case. The scheme is as simple as it gets. The FBI starts digging and the bank immediately cuts off the oxygen. The company loses both money and reputation at the most critical moment. This is called political warfare. It's just conducted by bank clerks in expensive suits. It even has an official name, Operation Choke Point. Its essence is absolutely simple. Authorities pressure banks to close accounts of the undesirables. The regulator labels the undesirables as high risk, and banks cut them off from money. This is a real financial blockade carried out without charges, without lawyers, and without court decisions. Just some banker in Washington woke up in a bad mood and decided to destroy another business. Or he was ordered to do so, and guess what? This long-practiced scheme has come to cryptocurrency. Look at what JP Morgan is doing. They just closed the account of Jack Mallers, the founder of the cryptocurrency payment service Strike. In the future, Strike plans to transform into a full crypto bank. When Mallers asked why they closed his accounts, JP Morgan responded in the classic way, "We don't owe you any explanation." And this lawlessness continues even today, after Trump has already signed an executive order that directly prohibits banks from closing company accounts just because they're connected to cryptocurrency. This is clearly not a coincidence. This is the same choke point architecture, the same weapon they used to hit Trump's business. Now it's aimed at crypto. Anyone connected to the new financial system is already in its crosshairs. And here, unfortunately, we come to politics, which has become tightly intertwined with something it shouldn't have been, Bitcoin. Look, it's not just about the banks. The Democrats don't just dislike crypto. They've declared total war on it. Brad Sherman, Elizabeth Warren, Gary Gensler and others. These are no longer impartial regulators but political players fulfilling orders, and they've passed sentence without even a trial. But look at reality. For years they've been telling us that cryptocurrency is no hedge, but a bubble that will soon burst. And what actually happened? The bubble didn't burst. Moreover, Trump won the presidential election in part because he bet on Bitcoin. But the further Trump went, the deeper he dove into it. And thanks to this immersion, his new sore spot was exposed. The new target is Trump's crypto ecosystem. Look at the circus Elizabeth Warren and Jack Reed have set up. They're demanding a federal investigation against World Liberty Financial. This is Donald Trump's project. Do you know what they're demanding it for? The project raised $550 million and they found transactions for $10,000 that they didn't like. They say these are suspicious funds from North Korea and Russia. Get out a calculator and calculate. $10,000 out of $550 million is 0.018%. That's not even a margin of error. It's just dust. Obviously, they only care about destroying the financial base of World Liberty Financial. Look at the voting results. Bills on cryptocurrency. The bill against the digital dollar. 210 out of 212 Democrats voted against these bills. And the remaining 2? Yeah, they just didn't show up for the vote. Obviously, they don't need regulatory clarity for cryptocurrency in the US. They don't need innovations. All they need is blockages, bans, and political warfare. They know perfectly well that Trump is now betting more on crypto than any politician in history. His company holds Bitcoin. He has miners. He has crypto infrastructure. His personal success and wallet are tightly tied to the Bitcoin chart. Therefore, when they hit World Liberty Financial, when they choke Microstrategy, when they sick MSCI on them, they're attacking not just the Bitcoin industry, they're hitting the president's pocket personally. It all becomes even more obvious when you see who's guarding the old system. Jamie Dimon, the most influential banker in America. For years, he's been acting not like a bank CEO, but like a political attack dog. Remember his most popular statement? He said that Satoshi Nakamoto is about to appear and crash Bitcoin to zero. Dimon claimed that's why the government needs to shut down Bitcoin. What's his agenda today? It's simple. He's standing firm for the independence of the US Fed. Why? Because the current Fed structure puts banks at the center of the universe. Dimon isn't a neutral banker. Dimon is the guardian of the old feeding trough. And now we've come to the main point. I'll show you what the real war is about. Forget about coins, bitcoins, companies on exchanges. All that is just fields for local clashes. The real war is between the old system and the new system. This is a war of two completely different financial architectures. The old system is the Democratic Party, anti-cryptocurrency legislators, banks, the Fed, MSCI, and the Department of Justice. And here's how their perpetual motion machine works. The Fed, which I remind you, is a private, not a government, shop, controls the banks. Banks control credit. Credit controls the markets. The more credit, the more inflated the markets. The more inflated the markets, the more important the index is. And who controls the indexes? That's right, MSCI. The circle is closed. The Fed operates in a vacuum, isolated from voters. You can't fire them. You can't influence them. And you can't know what they're talking about in closed corridors. The new system that Trump wants to implement works differently. His goal is simple and radical. Trump wants to strip the Fed of its sacred untouchability. He wants to take the printing press and transfer it to the US Treasury, where his person, Scott Bessent, is in charge today. What's the new revolution? Trump believes that decisions on interest rates and money should be made by politicians elected by the people, not a bunch of bankers in a closed room. And that's what scares these bankers to death. Trump isn't just advocating for cryptocurrency. He wants to shift the center of America's financial gravity, take power from the US Fed, take power from the bankers, and return it to the Treasury under personal control. If he succeeds, the Fed will lose its monopoly, and banks will lose their death grip on the economy's throat. Banks understand this perfectly. and Democrats understand it. And who are the main sponsors of the Democrats? Banks. Everything is connected. That's why they're attacking right now. They need to financially crush Trump before May 2026. That's when the term of the current US Fed chair expires. After that, Trump can appoint his own person to this post. A person who says that the entire economy of the future will be built on blockchain. In the White House, this is called the decisive battle, a historic chance to transfer control over money from the Fed and banks back into the hands of the people. That's why there's a race against time now, and all this reminds me of historical examples, of which there are many. I made a separate big video investigation about this. Be sure to watch it via the link in the description. It's very interesting. This struggle between presidents and the Fed, between the people and central banks, has been going on for more than a century. And this all leads us to the main question. Why are they trying to destroy MicroStrategy right now, precisely at this moment? Because for them, MicroStrategy isn't just an IT company. It's the largest vacuum cleaner that has already sucked in almost 4% of all bitcoins in the world. This is a financial gateway, when MicroStrategy takes debts, bonds, and converts them into Bitcoin. This is a massive but completely legal process. I'd call it a bridge that converts debts and bonds into Bitcoin. Imagine if MicroStrategy survives and continues this, then another 50 companies will follow its example. Another 100 companies, another 1,000 companies, tens of thousands of companies will do the same. The corporate Bitcoin standard will become the norm. The US Treasury will be able to create a national Bitcoin reserve. Trump will be able to simply bypass the banking system and gain independence from the US Fed. First, it's great that even die-hard crypto skeptics recognize that Bitcoin gives independence. Second, the enemy's logic is simple. To end Trump's plan, you first need to get rid of the bridge that leads to this independence. You need to collapse MicroStrategy. The new MSCI rule was invented precisely for this. The margin choke from JP Morgan was done exactly for this. Federal investigations were launched only for this. All this isn't random events, but part of a single, one might say, military strategy. And what happens next? We have only two options. Option 1, the old system wins, led by JP Morgan. On January 15th, MSCI approves this new rule. Forced selling of MicroStrategy shares begins, up to $9 billion. The Bitcoin Treasury model and Bitcoin Standard die. Bitcoin loses a gigantic influx of money, and Trump loses a piece of his financial infrastructure. And option number 2, Bitcoin wins, MicroStrategy wins, Trump wins, MSCI backs down. MicroStrategy continues to trade in the indexes. Corporate adoption of Bitcoin explodes. Stablecoins pump power from the Fed to the Treasury. The Fed loses control and Bitcoin becomes the strategic reserve of the US. The conclusion is simple. Everything we've seen lately isn't a random chain of events. This is a coordinated special operation that began back in Biden's time and escalated sharply after October 10, 2025. It has a specific goal and a strict deadline, January 15, 2026.